All right. Waiting for people to come on board. Welcome, 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 everyone. Thank you for joining Women's Way for closing the gender wealth gap forum on Let's Start at the Beginning, Understanding Wealth and Power. I am Diane Corman-Levy, the Chief Disruptor at Women's Way, and I am so delighted that you all decided to join us for the next 90 minutes with us on this very important discussion. While we wait for folks to sign on, I would appreciate you taking the poll located in the chat box. We want to know if this is your first time attending a Women's Way event. Thank you. And while you're doing this, I would like to hand over the mic to Candace Moody. Candace.
Thank you. Good evening, everyone. We would like to start by acknowledging that many of us on this call are on traditional territory of the Lenape Nation through a brief moment of silence.
Thank you, Candace. That's very important. Thank you. So today's forum is part of a year-long series whose purpose is to educate different stakeholders about the drivers of the gender wealth gap and action steps each of us can take to help close the gender wealth gap and create an economic system where all people thrive. Since October 2020, we have conducted 12 forums that address drivers of the gender wealth gap, such as strengthening the early childhood education sector, gender and racial disparities in healthcare, increasing access to affordable housing, promoting equity in grant making, and narrative change. Today's session, which we are really excited about, focuses on how wealth and power were built in America, something critical to understanding how do we close the gender and racial wealth gap. You will hear from three amazing panelists who will address this issue from provider, advocacy, research, and lived experience perspectives. You will also have opportunities to ask questions to the speakers via the Q&A button located at the bottom of your screen. We will do our best to address as many of your questions as possible. Closed captioning is enabled. If you do not want to see closed captioning, you can click Hide CC at the bottom of your screen. We will also record the session and make it available for you to view again for those who cannot attend today's session. Finally, to create a safe space for all of us to engage in this honest and challenging discussion, we ask each of you to abide to the session norms listed in the chat box. So before we introduce you to the panelists and moderator, Kelly Shear, the director of the Gender Wealth Institute, and I are going to spend just a few minutes providing an overview of the economic state of women and children, why Women's Way is so committed to investing resources into addressing the gender and racial wealth gap, and a high-level view of our theory of change for closing the gender wealth gap. So I want to share my screen. Does everyone see this? Yes. Awesome. So briefly, for those who don't know Women's Way, and I hope there's some new folks here, we are the region's leading nonprofit organization dedicated to the advancement of women and girls and gender and racial equity. And we're the first umbrella funding federation in the United States specifically dedicated to women's issues. So we've been at this work for about 45 years. The economic state of women, we've heard a lot about it pre-pandemic. We certainly heard a lot about it during the pandemic and post-pandemic. Just to give you an idea, we're not doing great. Before the pandemic, 80% of workers in the United States were living paycheck to paycheck, majority of women. 40% of adults were not able to cover an unexpected $400 expense. Again, majority are women. Philadelphia had and still has the highest poverty rate at just about 25% among the 10 largest cities, and the region's largest demographic group living in poverty are women, ages 25 to 34. Associated with this, and we're going to be talking about this, is the gender wealth gap, which is much worse than the pay equity gap, and is actually worsened. And associated with this is the retirement gap. 80% of women are likely to be living in poverty by the age of 65. So what is this? So what is the gender wealth gap? And if this is data from the Federal Reserve Bank of St. Louis, if you look at single white women, and this is how much wealth we own, and we'll talk about what we mean by that. Single white women only own 56 cents on the dollar compared to single white men. But if you look at Hispanic women, they own 10 cents, and non-Hispanic Black women only own 5 cents compared to single white men. Then if you look at the US economic pyramid, and this is not even the most current data, and has gotten worse since the pandemic. The top 1% of the population holds 47% of the nation's wealth. They're made up predominantly of independently wealthy folks, rich owners, and predominantly white Christian heterosexual men, while the 80% of the population only holds 9% of the nation's wealth. This is made up of a lot of middle working class individuals, unemployed, welfare individuals, individuals who are homeless, and many of them are women, particularly women of color. So why? So, we're talking about closing the gender wealth gap. And the question is, why do we have an economic system where 1% of the population holds 47% of the nation's wealth, and the majority are white Christian men? And the bottom 80% hold 9% of the nation's wealth, many of whom are women of color. Is this by chance? Is this just a byproduct of our capitalistic system? So why? And really importantly, how did we get here? Because our past history is our current history. And in order to answer these questions, we need to understand how wealth and power were built from the very beginning in this country. And we're going to be talking about that and doing a deep dive in that today. So if we really believe in an inclusive and equitable economy where everyone is able to thrive and live with dignity and peace, we need a new normal. We need a new bold vision for our economy, one that provides solutions to centuries of systemic exclusion, extraction, and exploitation. So how are we doing this at the Women's Way? We created something called the Gender Wealth Institute that was built on a foundation of working with over 100 partners who are very concerned about these issues. And it's called the Gender Wealth Institute's vision is really to close the gender wealth gap, but really to create economic liberation for all people, particularly those at the bottom of the economic pyramid, by advancing research and practical solutions that build wealth for women who are economically insecure. As we talk about wealth, it's really important to have a definition of wealth. And I think we've been conditioned by the dominant economic system to believe that that wealth is just it's about assets and liabilities, right? That's the capitalistic white dominant definition. But we want to expand it at Women's Way. So just read our expanded definition of wealth, and I'm going to point out some highlights. It's about living and retiring with greater dignity, freedom, and peace of mind. It's about providing future generations with the freedom to dream big and become all they truly can be. It's about being healthy for ourselves, but not just for ourselves, but for our family, networks, and communities, that they are healthy, spiritually whole, and contributing. So in order to address the gender wealth gap, we have to have a common understanding what we mean by wealth and all the forms of wealth. And we need to understand what it means to everyone, particularly those at the bottom of the economic pyramid, what wealth means to them. And then we need to address the practices and policies that have limited the accumulation of all these forms of wealth and the intentional extraction of wealth that has been happening for the past 400 years. So I'm going to pass this over to the amazing director of the Gender Wealth Institute, Kelly Shear.
Thank you, Diane. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Good. All right. Great. So if you have come to the Closing the Gender Wealth Gap series, you normally know that I do a lengthy presentation about white supremacy and connecting it to our topic at hand. But we have such depth of experience on the panel that this will be quite truncated because they have much more to say and much more to share. But I do want to provide some common framing and context for the connection between white supremacy and the gender wealth gap. So why do we even talk about white supremacy? White supremacy is a tool used to create, maintain, and perpetuate all gender and racial inequities. It's the operating framework or the motherboard of how all inequities work. Next slide. This slide provides an explanation of what white supremacy is and what it's there to do. Think of it like a tool. It's there to protect and hoard power, to disconnect and divide, and justify dehumanization. Next slide. White supremacy functions in a variety of systems. The common thread is the privileging of a constructed definition of whiteness and the dehumanization of all others. Whiteness becomes an asset. Take a minute to review how white supremacy shows up in various systems. Next slide. I'll also give you a minute to read this slide and quote. It's important to know that white supremacy is not just a tool used by whites. Consider the three things that white supremacy is here to do: justify dehumanization, hoard power, and disconnect and divide. Next slide. Before we get into the panel, we wanted to try something new and provide some visuals to connect to our topic today. Our hope is that you reflect on these images as you listen to the panelists and let it inform your experience. So this first piece is called "We Came to America" by Faith Ringgold. Next slide. And this next piece is "A Subtlety, or the Marvelous Sugar Baby" by Kara Walker. Next slide. Part of the work of liberation is to uncover the plot, that is, the intentions, actions, and outcomes. And that's what we'll do here today. Next slide. I'm very, very pleased to be able to introduce our panelist and moderator and to get into the meat of our conversation today. So first, I'd like to introduce Candace Moody. Candace, who uses they, them pronouns, is a board member of the Greater Lehigh Valley Chamber of Commerce's LGBTQ Business Council and the lead racial and ethnic justice community organizer at Community Action Lehigh Valley, an anti-poverty organization focused on advocacy and program development. Their role in this position spans from facilitator for the Generation Next program, a free college readiness course, to organizer with the Color Outside the Lines initiative, which is a 5 to 7 year strategic plan to address racial and ethnic disparities in the Lehigh Valley. Candace has a passion for multicultural studies, anti-racist advocacy, finance and generational wealth building, mindfulness, psychology, nonviolent communication, and comprehensive sex education. Welcome, Candace. Next, we have Dr. Onaje Muid. Dr. Onaje Muid is the Fatherhood Coordinator for the Foundation for Delaware County. He's a recognized authority on healing from historical trauma. He holds a doctorate and master's degree in social work, a license in mental health counseling, credentials in substance abuse, and family development counseling. Following his recognition as the recipient of the National Association of Social Workers Mid-Career Exemplary Leadership Award in 2014, and after completing his advising and adjunct lecturing appointments at Columbia University Graduate School of Social Work, he was inducted into the prestigious New York Academy of Medicine as Social Work Fellow in 2016. As an organizer for the People's Institute for Survival and Beyond, he practices the principles outlined in their Undoing Racism workshop. Welcome, Dr. Muid. Tiffany Younger. Tiffany Younger is a scientist, activist, and professor. Her work focuses on understanding how the U.S. economy, shaped by whiteness, patriarchy, and coloniality as a construct, materially impact Black women's health and well-being. As a Liberation Health Science Fellow at the Insight Center, she serves as the expert on qualitative research, working with the team to fill research gaps that center race and gender. In addition, she is building out her project, Liberation for Us, an interactive lab focused on building new measurement tools that center the lived experiences of Black, Latinx, and Indigenous women. Tiffany obtained her Master of Science degree in Social Policy at the University of Pennsylvania School of Social Policy and Practice. She is a lecturer at Columbia University's School of Social Work and University of Pennsylvania School of Social Policy and Practice, where she teaches social policy and human behavior and the environment. She is currently obtaining a dual doctorate degree in clinical epidemiology at Weill Cornell Medical College and social welfare at the Silberman School of Social Work. Welcome, Tiffany. Next slide. Finally, our moderator, Alicia Atkinson. Alicia serves as the Managing Director of Financial Empowerment at United Way of Greater Philadelphia in Southern New Jersey and brings a deep commitment to centering community in decision-making to shift systems towards racial equity and economic justice. In her current role, she is responsible for aligning strategic direction to community needs and opportunities, cultivating partnerships, and integrating philanthropic investment to support families, communities, and financial security initiatives in the region. Alicia has held prior leadership positions as Managing Director at the Prosperity Agenda, as well as Policy Analyst for the Government Affairs team at Prosperity Now. She holds a master's in public policy from the Heller School for Social Policy and Management at Brandeis University and a Bachelor of Arts in Psychology and Legal Studies from the University of Massachusetts Amherst. Welcome, Alicia. We have their full bios that we'll drop into the chat because there's so much more that everyone has done and so much more experience to share, so that'll be in the chat, but I'm happy to turn it over to you. Thank you.
Awesome. Thank you, Kelly and Diane, for that framing and for that welcome. Great to be here with you all. As Kelly mentioned, I'm Alicia Atkinson. I'll be moderating this panel today. And my hope for this conversation is just to really start challenging ourselves to continue learning and unlearning what we think we know, what we already know. And I'm just really honored to be here in this virtual space with these panelists. So with that, I'm going to kick us off with our first question, which is just to bring everyone's voice into this space. I'd love to hear from each of you around kind of how have you arrived here today? What has interested you about joining this panel? Sharing a little bit about your work and your organization, if that's interesting to answer to you. So I'll throw it to Candace, who can kick us off.
Awesome. Thank you so much. Just to reiterate, my name is Candace Moody. I also go by ACE for short, and I use they, them pronouns. My role is the lead racial and ethnic justice community organizer at Community Action Lehigh Valley, which is a nonprofit organization located in the Lehigh Valley of Pennsylvania, which is focused on anti-poverty and anti-racism in our community. So the mission of my organization essentially is to improve the quality of life of our community by creating access to economic opportunities, as well as the ability to pursue those opportunities and having a voice in the decisions that affect their lives. My agency actually has a total of 13 programs that span from youth programs like our Generation Next and SHE program. We also have a mental health services program for our community. Our organization also has a HUD certified first-time home buyer seminar that we offer that also includes a financial literacy course for community members. We also house our Rising Tide Community Loan Fund for individuals who are interested in starting their own startup business, as well as hosting our first harvest food bank in the community. And we also have our food bank that has partnered with some of the local elementary schools as well to provide food to students who are not able to get healthy options at home. Our agency also has a 42-acre seed farm, which is a huge accomplishment. And we also have a 6th Street shelter and so many more programs through my agency. So if you can see, we do a lot in the community to ensure that we are uplifting and empowering those in our community. So I chose to be on this panel for the main purpose of learning, just like everyone else, and also to encourage and learn more about this topic of wealth and how it influences our economic society. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Candace. Dr. O, can I throw it to you for the same question? Just tell us a little about yourself and what's brought you here today.
Sure, thank you very much. Onaje, Muid, they call me Dr. O for short. A disclaimer that I'm representing myself on the panel today, not the Foundation for Delaware County. What brought me here today, I guess, the realization of life. In social work, we say understanding human behavior and the social environment, but it's not just social. It has to be political. It has to be economical. In fact, it has to be historical. And once you bring historical, then we get to those two things that this country does not want to talk about. They do not want to talk about genocide of indigenous people, and they do not want to talk about the enslavement. So we're talking about the question of land and labor and how this capitalist system and society has benefited from that. And everyone has benefited from it because we are living here. So through my life, study, and pursuits, as a decolonizing social worker, I got here to this particular panel because I'm here to learn.
Awesome. Thank you for that. and Tiffany.
Yeah, thank you so much, Elisa. I'm here, when Kelly and Diane asked me to do something, I'm like, absolutely. But my background was very interesting because my training, I started out as a policy analyst when I came out of graduate school, and I worked for a United States senator. And then I transferred over, or explored my work and got into health disparities and really tackled the sciences. And from a social welfare, social work perspective, I started to notice some extreme gaps. And I started to ask questions, just like my other two panelists said. I started to do a deep dive of learning. And what I started to unpack was troubling and really made me want to start to ask deeper questions. And so a lot of my work right now is thinking about how did we build it? And being trained as a clinical epidemiologist taught me, the science taught me that how disease spread is, right? And so I use that framework and thinking when I think about wealth. How did we build it? And how is it spreading so that it is working, right? That's how we built it. And how do we build this economy? And so when I think about my work, I think about how the economy is oftentimes the root of killing a lot of folks, indigenous folks, Black women, Black men are being marginalized, right? Black children, brown children, right? And so I'm here because I would love to have that conversation with folks and engage in what that actually means, and push the conversation and have critical reflection. Because like the doctor just said, we're all a part of it. And so when we start to critically reflect, I hope that we come to some resolutions.
Amazing. Thank you all for offering those insights already to the space. And we're going to kick it off with kind of using the title as inspiration here, but really starting with why is it important to understand how wealth and power are built in America when we're thinking about addressing the racial and gender wealth gap. And so I'm going to go in reverse order, if that's okay with you, Tiffany. So actually throw it to you first, and we'll go that way. So yeah, what are your thoughts on that? Why is it important? As you started to allude to, yeah.
Yeah, I mean, thank you, Alicia. I think that we love to solve something, right? And I think as it relates to, I use what I watch from clinical professionals and doctors, they would never diagnose or treat anyone without a historical history of a patient. They would never. And so when I started to just sit back and watch, I realized the disconnect in the economic justice world, the social security world, all of these social policy worlds. I'm like, we are trying to address something without fully understanding how it was actually created. And when I work with graduate students, a lot of my students, I'm asking them, how did we build this? And it is really surprising to me because they're at elite universities, they don't know how it was built. And they're supposed to lead as medical professionals, social work practitioners, and solve some issues. And so for me, in order to really start to think about liberation, in order for us to think about what the resolve would be, we have to be clear about what it is. And so that's why I think it's very much important to ask, what is wealth? And what do we mean by power? And what is my position in this?
Yeah, you can't solve a problem you don't understand. Yeah, that's very well put. Dr. O, what are your thoughts? Anything to add on to what Tiffany shared about why it's important to understand where wealth and power come from when addressing this gap? Yeah.
I do believe it's a question of the future that we see for ourselves and for our children. I'm a grandfather. I'm trying to get my grandson married so I can be a great grandfather, but he's not, he's not responding. So I don't know what's happening there. But it's really about the future. What do we see for the future? We can't change the past, but we can correct the past. And see, we have this language that says we want to make changes. That's a falsality. We don't need changes. What we need is a correction. Why? Because Dr. Jones taught me that when you have the original assault, there is a disability, there is a disadvantage, there are discrepancies. And if you don't correct those things from the beginning, from the original assault, those things will carry on to the second level. So you don't have to use the same thing anymore. You can just use those barriers where you don't have enough education. You don't have experience. Well, how come I don't have education experience? Because you wouldn't let me go to school, right? So we have to make corrections, not changes. The question is, why are people poor? Right? Not only how did we get here, but why are people poor? And this is one of the questions that's asked by the People's Institute for Survival and Beyond. And they have a workshop called Undoing Racism, which I would ask everyone to take. The second organization I like to reference is the United for a Fair Economy out of Boston. They're doing tremendous work in terms of helping us understand these things. So the why is, what kind of life do we want? To some extent for ourselves, but certainly for our children. This is really a futuristic process. And this is why I'm a reparations activist. It's not just enough to be involved in human services. We have to also be involved with human rights. So if we're not, in fact, pushing for implementation of the Covenant on Social and Cultural Rights, we're just dealing with, the consequences of this trajectory rather than dealing with the root cause. So we have to include human rights in the work that we're doing. So the why is, what kind of future do we want for our children, and what kind of future do we want for this country and not the world? Let me also say, if you will, that when we use the designation nation, what we don't even realize that we are limiting ourselves. We know that there's a Lakota nation, right? We know that there's a Lenape nation. We know that, whatever is it, 54 recognized nations by this government. We are multinational national government. And without that understanding, we'll continue to actually participate in the myth of America than the reality.
Awesome. Thank you for that, Dr. O. And Candace, do you also want to share?
Piggybacking on a lot of what was already shared. But I want to start by just stating that one of the very first things that I learned in my business classes in college was America rewards those who have ownership. So if you don't own anything, you have no economic power. And that ownership looks like home ownership, owning land, owning businesses like startups, franchises, stocks and bonds, and even insurance. Economists typically consider the building blocks of any economy to be the production of 4 factors, which are land, labor, capital goods, and entrepreneurship. All 4 of these factors contributed to the economic development and growth of our country through slavery. And it's also important for us to understand this history as the racial and ethnic demographics are changing within our country. For the first time in our country's history, the white population has seen a decline over the last decade. And by the year 2040, it's projected that our country will be a majority people of color. So what does this mean for those who have the economic power? And do those individuals have everyone's interest in mind? By being able to fully understand our past, we can then begin to understand our present today and also plan for our future. So it's really essential that in order for us to understand where we want to go as a nation, we must be willing to reconcile with our past. And the only way for us to do that is to come face to face with a lot of these ugly truths and really lead through authenticity and through integrity, because we can't heal something if we're not willing to recognize it.
Thank you, Candace. We wanted to kind of take the conversation a little bit further into some of the things you guys already mentioned, but really talking about wealth extraction, which again, Candace, you started talking about some of the ways we've extract not only wealth, but dignity and humanity in our past. And, you know, when we think about wealth, we often think about adding to the bank account or adding to this thing, but we often forget that really this extraction of wealth is a huge reason why we are where we are today. So I was going to start with Dr. O with this question about really, could you speak to the role that wealth extraction has played in creating the current conditions that we're seeing around gender and racial wealth disparities?
Thank you so very much for that question. And, you know, we have to go back to 1776, right? You had four things coming together that really was the foundation. You had the Constitution. You had this concept of race. It's hard for us to imagine there was no such thing as race in 1776. You know, Blumenbach, you know, came up with this idea of race. There was no such thing as race. There's only one race, the human race. But it came up then, and also Adam Smith, right? That's three. And what's the fourth is the people. How did all those things combine in such a fashion to ensure that the same people, just another myth. We said we had a revolution. Okay, you had some colonialists who were here because they had a charter. And then you had this thing called the revolution, and the same people who had power before the revolution had the power after the revolution. So when we gloss over that, just because they disentangled themselves from the so-called mother country, England, it wasn't a revolution. So we have this myth that it was, so the same people that were in power prior were the same people in power after. And going a step further to 1865, when after a proclamation, there was white landowners who got reparations, right, in terms of losing the land. And we can talk about, you know, those kind of steps, that how it started and how. So we really have the very same thing, which means what? We went from 13 colonies using the same mentality. Now we create domestic colonies. And these domestic colonies had the same relationship with the people at the bottom. The United States had the same relationship with the people at the bottom of society as they did when England had control over the land. And those things was what? Exploitation, domination, and control. And every policy from that point forward said the same thing. Someone said there's 6 things to make that keep people poor: deplete their wealth, strip their income, take away their home, hit them with fines and fees and fleece them, criminalize them, and most insidious, let their children suffer. The most important thing as it relates to people of African descent was criminalization. It's called Criminalization of a Race by Dr. McIntosh. Criminalization of a race started, and so the 13th Amendment says what? Slavery and servitude is abolished, except in the case of a punishment of a crime. So we just shifted how slavery was actually implemented. It's never left. It's still here with us, but we think that it was abolished. How can something be abolished when you put in the clause except? How can you do that? So we're talking about what? The prison industrial complex, are people being criminalized, and then from the very beginning. So we start from chattel slavery, we move into the sharecrop system, we move into convict lease system, we move into the peanut system, we move into the Jim Crow era, and now we into the mass incarceration era. This is a straight line. It's the very same thing with just a different institutions, but all of it results in the same thing, right? So we talk about 3/5 of a man to deny people in the South to have a vote. How many people of color are in prison in other counties, and those counties can count them as their population, but they can't vote? So we see the same system that started in 1776 that is current today. And I'll end by saying, in 1790, to be an American, you had to be an adult and you had to be white. And interesting enough, that thing stayed on the books until 1952, the year I was born. So this white supremacy thing is something that, you know, people don't want to ignore. They want to look away from, but you can't look away from it. It's like the sun is this blind in your eyes. You have to look at it. And we're taking the step to be courageous about it. And I'd like to thank all the panelists, and certainly like to thank the organization for putting a panel together like this.
Thank you, Dr. O. I think something that's kind of striking me right now is this word, like this use of history. Like we say history, but it's not really history. It's today, you know. I want to also give Tiffany a chance to respond to this idea of wealth extraction and the role it's played, or anything you want to add or respond to.
So Dr. O did an amazing job. I definitely wanted to build on, like, we had mass incarceration and now it's the pandemic, and this is the new era that we are walking into, because when I think about the way that we are inheriting the caseload of COVID for the rest of our lives, and what that is directly doing to communities who have already been marginalized, to what Dr. O said, historically, right? And this is going to be this natural thing, right? Survival of the fittest. When you're ready, to Dr. O's point, put us in a space where we couldn't survive because you didn't build it for us to survive. And I say us because I'm a part of it, right? And this is the intricate insidiousness of this, is what Dr. O outlined, right? Like, you can't see it. It's interlocking systems of oppression. So now it's like, you know, predisposition to hypertension. And I'm like, well, people, what is hypertension? And how come they all look like me and Dr. O and Ace? Why that's anti-Blackness. I'm starting to see the disparity. See, the thing about science and the thing about, there's no hypertension gene. What is going on here? And I want us to be very clear about these things that people are saying, right? These are epigenetics. It is disgusting. It is insidious. And Dr. O started from 1776. I'm gonna take us back to 1492, when we stole the land, when they stole the land from the indigenous folks, and the erasure of indigenous people. We see it right now in the disparities. We see it right now. People are like, oh, what's happening to them? What do you mean what's happening to them? Of course this is happening. This is how we built it. The exclusion of women. So even white women, they only got some rights, right? So you start to see this, right? And then you see Black men, and like just the way that racism affects Black men, gendered racism, in a way that the patriarchy can't even thrive for them in some cases, because they're preyed upon the moment that they're in the womb of their mothers. This is the extraction. The extraction is the moment that you are born darker skin, anti-Blackness is showing up. The moment. That's what the interlocking systems, your time is ticking. It's a ticking time clock. Those are the environments that we are literally navigating. And so I want us to stop thinking about wealth like assets. Like, I don't want what Jeff Bezos has. I want you to leave us alone and let us be able to live healthy lives and be able to take care of our children and communities. And I think that's what we have to start to think about when we think about the work and wealth.
Thank you so much, Tiffany. Candace, do you want to chime in on
this
question?
Yeah. Thank you so much. I really love, everything that Tiffany just stated. Just to, expand on that a little bit. We really did start the foundation of this country with the stealing of native land, which created this separation of families, which is truly one of the greatest assets that individual can have, is their family unit. Also, like the land being stolen through these false treaties and Native nations being forced to establish reservations on land that's typically, you can't grow crops on them. They don't have many natural resources, so it's not very profitable to live on these pieces of land. Our nation has a huge history of racism. I'm not going to go through everything, as Dr. O really went through a great timeline with that, but I really wanted to touch on a lot of the destruction of self-sufficient Black economies like Tulsa, Oklahoma, which happened in 1921, or Rosewood, Florida, which happened in 1923. And even more recently, which is more local to home, is the Muid bombing of 1985, where we saw a Black liberation group dedicated to natural and holistic lifestyle literally being bombed in the city of Philadelphia to be wiped away so that we cannot be self-sufficient. We have a history of this exploitation and wealth extraction throughout our country's national history that continues to happen to today. These are just a few instances that are being told and that we know about. And oftentimes we don't learn these in our history classes. These are things that we don't learn until we get to college, or unless you know someone who has that information to share with you. So I just want to, really bring to light how we really need to do our own learning to understand how wealth has been extracted from these communities to be able to move further as a nation together.
Alicia, can I add to that?
Yeah, of course. Yes, please.
If you look at, so in political terminology, we talk about constitutions or social contracts. Yusuf Clyde came out with his book, I forget what year it was, it's called the AntiSocial Contract. And what he shows us in this very short booklet, that there was a written contract, the Constitution, and it's durable and it's permanent. And there also was an anti-social contract that was put in place at the very same time, but it's invisible, you don't see it. So the anti-social contract, how does it get presented in the policies that we see, right? Going back to the group in Boston, United for a Fair Economy, they had something called government boosts and blocks to building wealth. And on top is, it's build, on the bottom, it's things which are taken away. But the anti-social contract put in place from the very beginning oppression through commission and oppression through omission. So when you leave a people out of an agreement, they don't exist as a legal entity. So it's not about access to medical services. It's not about a high quality service. It's none of those things. It's those things plus the question of status. If you're not recognized as a full human being, everything that's going to happen to you is going to be less than a human being. So the whole science of dehumanization was codified in the anti-social contract by Yusuf Clyde.
Thank you so much for that. And that kind of builds, both of the last comments kind of build onto our next question, which is around narratives and kind of storytelling and kind of the narratives that get repeated and the stories get told. I feel like I've heard a few, I've probably missed a lot, but like this idea of American exceptionalism, this idea of anti-Blackness. I'd love to hear if there's other ones that I've missed that you guys have already mentioned, or if there's other ones that you want to bring into this space around, what are these kind of insidious narratives that we get told? And, again, unless the work that Candace just presented to us, we really try to unpack it and try to delve in, we feel like are repeated or kind of the default, right, are the status quo. And Tiffany, I'd love to start with you if you're comfortable kicking us off on this idea of what are these narratives? How do they uphold and justify our current economic system? And, again, to Dr. O's point, who's telling these narratives and, who's in these seats repeating them over and over again?
Yeah, thank you for that, Alicia, because I think narratives, thinking about one of my mentors, Ann Price, who really forced me to think about the way that narratives mentally shift us and also start to perpetuate these cycles, right? One of the narratives to me that I've realized, and I've also practiced in my earlier days as a policy analyst, was, you just got to work harder. You got to work harder and you got to save, financial literacy. And I'm like, God bless, my soul. You can't work your way out of oppression. You cannot labor your way out of oppression. You cannot financially literacy your way out of oppression. My question is, where is the other money that is owed, to Dr. O's point? Where is the reparation? Like, what am I, $30,000 is not enough. What am I doing? How can I use financial literacy to live in America? I live in New York City with $30,000. What can Chase help me with? Are they going to give me the $100,000 that they owe me and my family so I could then think about what? And this is the work that we have to start to think about as experts, as people who are practicing it, as normal day common folks. We have to sit down. When I talk about critical reflection, is what are the beliefs? One thing that I see in the way that labor is showing up in a narrative of labor is showing up in like the health world. I'm on a cancer disparities work project, and they're trying to figure out how come the white women patients are living and the Black women patients are dying. And I'm like, because they don't have time to heal. Because we don't have a system where the chemo isn't racist. You know what is, we're like, the chemo isn't racist. So stop saying the chemo. No, we have to think about, what does it mean to be a Black woman or occupying a Black body in America? Do you have time to rest and heal? No, you don't. You want to know why? Because to Dr. O's point, we don't have reparations. So now we have to work. We got to feed these kids. We become community-owned gatekeepers. All of these other different labor forces, we're inside of the work world, dealing with micro, quote unquote, aggressions, trying to hold space for Billy to figure out his stuff, then coming home to our children. And then like, this is all labor, and then gotta figure out how to take the chemo and heal. And we do not account for that. And that is all labor. And so the narrative of labor has got to stop. We do not need to work anymore. We cannot work our way out of this. It is built this way. Now, what is the question?
Thank you so much for that, Tiffany. Yeah, Candace, do you want to chime in on the idea of narratives or just react to anything that was just shared too?
Yes, I would love to. This is one of my favorite topics to actually talk about in the work that I do. We talk about myths very, very often, which are essentially the narratives that we play into in our country. One of the very first narratives or myths that we've been fed is this myth of manifest destiny. It's this idea that white people were intended by God to take the land of indigenous people and others in order to possess the whole of what is called the United States. You can see this example perfectly in the lyrics of "This Land Is Yours," from sea to shining sea. The song that celebrates the land that is owned by, possessed by Native Americans and then forcibly being acquired by the white settlers who came here through genocide and oppression and the forced removal of the indigenous people. We also hear a lot about this narrative of meritocracy, which is a lot of what Tiffany was just getting at. This myth of meritocracy is this idea that all individuals must pull themselves up by their bootstraps and do whatever a person can to end up in the position that they want to end up in economically, socially, wealth, whatever you want to call it. It's this idea that those who work hard attain success, and those who don't work hard, essentially it's your fault because you didn't work hard for it, and you can't blame anybody else. This myth takes away all community responsibility, the influence of social systems that are rooted in racist ideology, and completely ignores all systems of oppression and privilege that contribute to individual success or non-success. This leaves no room for individual experiences, such as how we see the world, how we feel and think and behave in this world. It plays directly into a us versus them mentality. The very last myth that narrative that I really want to touch on is this idea of the American dream. I swear, if I hear a politician say the American dream one more time, y'all could do a drinking game to it. If you do any debate, you can do a drinking game to how many times they say the American dream. I don't really understand what that means, because the idea that's been fed to us is you buy a home, you get married, you have kids, you get a good job, and you start investing in your 401k. That's truly this idea of the American dream, but it doesn't really help with us being able to understand how that fits for Black Americans or Native Americans or Latinx Americans or those who belong to the LGBTQ community. It really only supports those who are cisgendered heterosexual couples who have this idea that they want access to these opportunities through the American dream.
Thank you so much for that. And I'm going to pass it to you, Dr. O, in a sec, but I do just want to tell folks we're going to transition to audience Q&A in the next about 10 or 15 minutes. So would love for people, if they're feeling compelled to ask a question, to put that in the Q&A chat. But yeah, Dr. O, do you have anything to add about kind of this idea of narratives? I love how Candace just actually said myths, which I actually feel like is an interesting kind of thing to play with here around like myths versus narratives. But kind of ones that you feel like are being upheld and why they're being upheld and by who, and just any reactions you have.
Okay, this is the one that's going to like really upset a lot of folks. This one right here, what I'm about to say is, so just get ready for your upset, because you're going to get really upset right now, right about now. Let's go back to 1452, when the Pope said, you noble Christians, you can go out and you can seize the land of the pagans, and you can take them, you can kill them, it's fine because they're not Christians. 1492, 500 years before I was born, right? The myth of what? That Jesus Christ was white. Jesus Christ, really? In the land that you're talking about where he was born, there was white people there? Really? Caucasians were there? White? So religion has the myth of, wow. Let me tell you how bad this is. This is going to really shock you. A friend of mine went to Ghana, and he told me that he was walking down the street, wherever he was going, and he heard another person say, an African, a Ghanaian, say to another Ghanaian, that because I saw a white person, I don't need to go to church. Because I saw another white person, I don't need to go to church because I filled my religious obligation. That is really, really, I don't even know if I have a word for it, deprived, right? But it's the same, where did it come from? It comes from the depravity that says, let's kill the Indian so we can save the man. How can a mind come up with that? That's a deprived man, a deprived mentality. So when we talk about whiteness and we talk about the insidiousness and in which ways it's like a disease that creates all these false narratives and gets people to accept them and believe them. So much so that Black women are bleaching their face. Black men too, right? The whole thing is like, I have to be white because the aesthetic of being beautiful has to be white. Light skin, straight hair. So the narrative, the narrative is to Black people, get over it, get over it. Whatever happened to you, it's in the past. And Allison, you made a very important point. You said history is not gone in the past, it's happening right now, right? And Tiffany talked about epigenetics. This is the science that tells us that if you have so much happening to you from the environment, it changes the way in which your genes gets expressed. And that expression is more likely than not is going to relate to a deformity, it's going to relate to some disadvantage in which now you come into the world already superimposed upon. And now you have to go through the system with more constraints and more policies, right? So we have to understand, and COBRA, the National Coalition of Blacks for Reparations in America, came out with what is called the Harm Report, where they actually give the whole history of this. But this is what we have to do. We have to use science to understand the depth of this oppression and how it's in the body and how it's getting expressed. So the myth, get over it. No, we're not going to get over it. The myth that we can have peace without justice, no, we can't do that. It's just not going to happen. And someone said earlier, like, how does this thing continue? It really continues Frederick Douglass says power never stop without where there's no power, where there's no struggle, there's no power, right? It may be a physical struggle, it may be a moral struggle, but it must be some combination. And because where there's no struggle, there's no progress, right? It's only when the people, right? So we're talking about social movements. We're not talking about a balanced budget. We're not talking about financial literacy. It's only when the people decide that the limits of tyrants is enough. And when that happens, that's going to be the change that we see. And then we saw a glimpse of that with George Floyd. People just said, that is it. How can you even do something like that, show it on the film, on the TV, and people just said, and that's going to happen. It's going to happen more and more again until people actually take what is there, which is their right to their life and their freedom and their liberation.
Can I ask what Dr. O said? Because Diane asked a question about this religion and the role of like the exploitation of Black and brown folks, particularly with the church. And I'll speak as a Reformed Christian, right? Like I'm still a Christian, and to Dr. O's point, this idea that the religion aspect of Christianity and the way that it is almost violent to Black and brown bodies and the recycling of, the sin and, I want to speak specifically about what I witnessed as a Black woman and the way that it has shunned Black women. Ways that we think about marriage as equal in wealth. And I'm gonna tell you right now, as a researcher, it does not. We do not get wealth from marriage, Black women. And that's statistically, I'm right, like we don't get the same benefits of white nuclear families. And so those are the myths that we are often, I'm not against marriage, hear me, right? But when we start to tell these myths, then it's like something is wrong with you, right? When we start to label folks as baby mamas and single moms, these insidious ways, and even one thing about gender spectrum of how we kill Black trans women and discard their lives so easy. And we should have been raising the flag when Black trans women came up missing, right? The discarding of Black life was continuously perpetuating this cycle of like violence and wealth. And that is bestowed in the Black church, in the church in general, in all churches across, and religion, right? And like we have to start to take some accountability for that, because we also need to come back and reshape narratives and apologize, because we're starting to call people out for what it is, right? But there's not this reckoning with the churches, right? Like the harm that has been done and the psychological harm that has literally, mentally, Black gay men, what they did to Black gay men, we have to have these conversations. And religion is key to this.
Thank you so much, Tiffany. And I think something that's really sticking with me, if I may share this right now, is like, I think sometimes, I'm going to say this, but like, it sometimes seems indulgent to like go and understand history, or it seems like, people just want to move forward, right? We kind of just want to be, and we talked about this a lot in the prep of the panel, like people want action, people move forward. But this key piece, I feel like what everyone is sharing today, it's like, this is the work, to go back and understand. Tiffany, what you shared about, there's research going into the, people going through cancer treatment and dying. It's like, it's all repeating itself, right? Because we're not truly understanding what the conditions are, and the history of why these conditions are here. And I did want to kind of bring us actually to pick up a thread that Candace put down about this idea of the American dream, and we talked about kind of in our prep about how that's been very, white, elite, male centric. And we talked about kind of thinking about the past, but also kind of in this push to kind of think about putting stuff out into the universe. Like, I almost want to use the word, like, what are the narratives that we wish people were talking about regard to Blackness, around to our history? What is the, because there's joy in the history of Black and brown America that we often don't leave space for. And so I would love to hear from all of you about kind of like, how do you think about wealth? That definition that was shared at the front of this session. But what do you want to put out there in the universe that's different than what we hear every day around wealth and around this topic in general? I hope that question made sense. I kind of just melded a few, but who does anyone feel compelled to go first? Or I kind of lost my order here, but yeah.
I don't mind if it's
Go ahead,
okay.
Dr. O. Yeah.
Dr. Hassan Batts, who, you know, is just extraordinary human being. It's just, it's extraordinary. When he tells me the stuff he's doing, well, I'm going to Morocco. Well, I'm going to Dominican Republic. I'm like, what? Well, his organization, Promised Neighborhood, Lehigh Valley, he's created something called Soul, right? SOUL, right? And it starts with strengths, people accepting their strengths and recognizing their strengths, and being able to come into the space with that. Then he moves on to O for opportunity. What opportunities do we have when we're in this space together for that moment or for that particular campaign, whatever it is? And then after that happens, U is us, right? Unity. Did it bring us closer together? Because whatever you experience between the S and the O, if it didn't bring you together, then it's counter-revolutionary and it's a negative. And then all of this has to lead to L, liberation, right? So having a new way of seeing, and we have to start with soul, because soul was the first things that Europeans said that people of color didn't have, right? So we have to affirm the fact we have a soul, not because you told us we did or we didn't, because we are forming it for ourselves. So it has to start with soul. So SOUL. So that's one way that we can think about how we can move forward that, you know, celebrates the joy. And when we get together, it is really phenomenal. But I wouldn't be able to feel comfortable in terms of leaving the discussion without talking about redlining. And as we know what redlining is in terms of the practices where they put, you know, a red line around an area and said, well, don't, that all this is just another way of keeping the plantation system in place. We're still living on a plantation, but we don't want to recognize it. We have to call it for what it is. We're still living on plantations. And this is why Dr. Martin Luther King said that we're living in domestic colonies. Dr. Martin Luther King, you never heard that speech. He said, we're living in domestic colonies. So if we don't appreciate domestic colonialism, we won't understand the severity of the problem. But redlining, when I looked at a short clip, the person said something quite interesting. He said, if you look at redlining, it's almost as if the people are being punished, like sanctions, like an international, like Cuba, for example, right? You have these sanctions against Cuba. Why? Because they wanted to be free, right? So when you look at redlining, you see a people who have gone through errors and errors and errors of this punishment, of this sanction. Because why? Because we're really foreign. See, we think we're American, but we're really foreign. How do I know that? Because the way I'm being treated. But I'm going to celebrate the joy. I'm going to celebrate Black love. I'm going to celebrate Black lives. I'm going to celebrate these Black babies. And I'm going to say that we have to figure out this thing about the fourth trimester, where so many Black women are dying, you know, unnecessarily, and all these things are most of them are preventable, right? There's a film that's called Aftershock on Hulu. I'm asking everyone to look at that, and then you'll get a better understanding of birth inequity and the problems that persist in terms of. But I'm still celebrating life. But I want you to look at that film of Aftershock.
Yeah, go ahead, Candace. Sorry, take yours.
Oh, no, you're fine. I didn't know if you were going to chime in.
No.
Oh, okay. Well, so I love this question. That's probably my favorite question out the entire panel. For me, this term wealth is very synonymous with holistic well-being. And I see Tiffany, you know, me and you talked before when we were doing the planning sessions. So I know that's a huge thing for you as well as Dr. O. This is essentially the unified components of physical, mental, emotional, social, and spiritual health.
And political. And political.
Well, and political, yes, thank you. And political. And it's not just in the individual, but it's also in the community as well. It's this collective healing of the people in the community and their environments. True wealth, to me, is transforming this idea of surviving into thriving. So culturally, I feel that many of us have been conditioned to believe in this idea of wealth being money, power, respect. I know many of us on the call have to have known the song by the Lox. But I like to reflect back on when I was in middle school. I learned about a man who had no money and no power, but he held a great deal of respect from his community. And with this respect, he received power. And with that power, he accumulated money. This man's name was Nelson Mandela. And during his 27 years in prison, Nelson Mandela wrote a series of different letters to his wife, Winnie Mandela. And I just wanted to read a quote from one of those letters that he wrote on February 1st of 1975. He stated that in judging our progress as individuals, we tend to concentrate on external factors such as one's social position, influence and popularity, wealth, and standard of education. But internal factors may be even more critical in assessing one's development as a human being. Things like honesty, sincerity, simplicity, humanity, pure generosity, and the absence of vanity. This readiness to serve others. These are all qualities in which are easy to reach for every soul and are the foundation of one's spiritual life. For me, this encompasses the real ideology of what wealth is and should look like.
That's beautiful. Thanks so much, Candace, for bringing that quote to the space. Tiffany, do you want to chime in?
I just want to build off of what Dr. O and Candace said, because they both touched on two things that I was thinking about when we think about like what it could look like. But Dr. O spoke about redlining, and like I go back to like the science of redlining, how we stop doing things, but we don't undo it. And so to Dr. O's point, you can pull up maps today, and there's a few things you can see. The allostatic load, high, that's a whole nut, right? The wear and tear, the stress load, this is simplified terms. The hypertension load, like I'm telling you, I've been just looking at these maps. So to Dr. O's point, that the sanctioning of redlining and the intergenerational replication, we're gonna trap you in your communities, remove resources, put a liquor store, Chinese restaurant, maybe a right? Like all of these, the air is terrible, right? That's what redlining did. And I don't think we really start to think about what that actually means. Then we say, oh, you can live wherever you stop it, right? Like Midtown, it's too much money, right? So we have to start to think about redlining in that way, because it's very key. And then to Candace's point, this idea of wealth, even when you get it, when I've started to do research with Black women, they've reached, I'm talking about top of their field. And to Candace's point, the well-being, the well-being down the drain. Black women, Black men down the drain. And I've literally looked at home health aides. So Black and Latinx women, home health aides who made like $20,000, and compared them to Black women executives, Latinx executives, and some Indigenous women, top 350K. The narrative is the same. They're both dirty and dangerous jobs. They're treated as if they are not valued. The work is high. There's no well-being. And so when we think about like the money, and yes, the money is a relief, right? I don't want to take away the fact that when you make that amount of money, there is some sort of relief. But when I think about what Candace said, when I think about true well-being, it is not there. So we do not benefit from the same like US wealth definition that white bodies actually and white men actually benefit from, right? It actually is, the actual creation of wealth is trained to exploit and extract from us and make us feel sick and ill. Think about, these are plantation economies we're running. That's what it is. They're plantation economies. And so what I think about when I think about the future, I think about Black joy, collectivism, creativity, and imagination, right? Like I want to sit down in my bed and watch whatever I want to watch without thinking about I want to imagine what the life, like Dr. O said, could be for my child Grace. She shouldn't have to live like this. What would that actually look like? We don't have time to imagine, but we are very creative and we work collectively. That's one thing we're gonna do. We're gonna work together and we're gonna be creative.
That's awesome. So we do have a question in the Q&A, and I would definitely, we have about 15 more minutes where we can take some questions. So feel free if you're feeling, oh, I'm seeing more come in. This is exciting. So one of the questions that we were thinking we would get, which I think we were going to end on, but I think it's important to be responsive. So one of the questions is just the suggestions to remedy the situation. So we kind of talked about in our prep panel about policies. I know there's funders on this call, practitioners. You all are currently working on these things. So are there some things that, thinking about those definitions that you all just put out there around these like expanded holistic version of wealth, when you're thinking about people's well-being beyond just their financial well-being, what should we be thinking about? I know reparations have already been talked about, but are there other things that we should be considering at this phase?
I think we should think about how we design our programs. So I'm speaking specifically to the funders and to the people who are running programs. I think we should think about how we can't program our way out of this either. Right? It's a structural, systematic thing. So the question becomes, the remedy is, what is the purpose of this program? And I'm gonna give you the answer. It should be liberatory. It shouldn't be more labor. So we shouldn't require folks to do 2011 things in order to engage in our activities. We should try to give money away the best that we need a guaranteed food stamp program right now in the United States. The eggs are $7, right? I want us to think about, what does it mean to release control and to trust that the people we are serving know what is best for them. And those are the questions, that's the remedy. When we think about, we're about to design this program, or we're gonna fund this program, right? The root of the money is stolen. That's the first thing for funders, right? Like, the root of the money is stolen. So given that, what type of program should be in place? How can it be liberatory? How can we lessen the amount of labor for the actual recipients? How can we take away control? How can we give? These are the ways that we should start to think about programming, because we can't program our way out of this.
Thank you for that, Tiffany. Dr. O or Candace, do you want to chime in on this question of kind of what's to be done? What would you give for advice or food for thought for folks who are anxious to, I guess, yeah, go ahead, Candace.
Yeah, I would say the very first step that you can take, it don't cost any money, it only costs your time, which is to decolonize your mind from white supremacy culture.
Wow.
Like, that's the very first step that you can take, and it's not necessarily the easiest step either, but it don't really cost that much to educate yourself. It's really unpacking what white supremacy culture is and how it actually shows up in our day-to-day life, because I guarantee you it shows up in every aspect of our life, and we have been conditioned to implement it in our personal lives, our romantic lives, our work life, any aspect of our life and social being. We have implemented white supremacy culture. So being able to understand what that looks like and decolonize ourselves from it, I think should be the number one step, and if not the most important step, because it's a lifelong journey. It's not something that you take a course and it's one and done. It's not like you go to some type of seminar or even a webinar like this and you're good, you got all the information you need. It's something that you take with you your entire life, and you continue to unlearn and relearn. It's that continuous cycle of unlearning and relearning and really educating ourselves so that we're not continuing to perpetuate these things and do harm, and to make sure that our communities are able to come together as well, and understanding it from a culturally humble position instead of this competency, which you typically will hear cultural competent. You can't be culturally competent in someone else's culture. Be humble yourself and educate yourself.
I like to pick up on that. Thank you, Candace. We talk about decolonizing the mind. There's a video called Decolonizing Social Innovation on YouTube by Dr. Mia, which is excellent. And I'll start by saying the People's Institute for Survival Mayon says, listen, why do we start off with a needs analysis? Like, why do we do that? Like, how did it get needy in the first place, number one? And what we need to practice and understand is how do you do a power analysis, which is called the foot on analysis. Because if you go to any corner, they'll tell you so-and-so got their foot up by, right? So we have to do a power analysis so we can see how this monster is actually happening and how all these different things are impacting the people in these domestic colonies. The second thing is we have to declare racism a public health crisis. By not doing that, you're allowing it to just exist without any kind of collective micro, meso, macro analysis of what the problem really is. So, and there are many places where that has been done. So once that's out there, then we go to the third level, and the third level is that we have to demand reparations. You can't put a baby size shoe on my foot. It's just too big. I wear size like 12, 13. It's just the baby shoe just won't fit. So we need to have a solution that in fact matches the problem. And once we do that, then we have a possibility of actually making the corrections instead of the changes. So those are the 3 steps that I would say are essential.
That's great. Oh, go ahead. Yeah, go ahead, Tiffany. Yeah.
I want us to think about, one more thing I want us to think about as we're trying to think about some solutions is how we think about gender. And what I've noticed just from being in the field is that we cloak gender with womanhood, and they're not like, I want us to do some real gender work because the patriarchy is not allowing for any of us to be human.
Yeah.
And I just want to say that, like, I want us to really, as a society, as a field, to explore gender, because it is not man and woman. And we have to look at the way that patriarchy is centered and killing all of us.
Beyond grateful for that, Tiffany. Thank you.
Yes.
Beyond grateful for that. If I could add just one more thing.
Yes, of course.
While Dr. O was talking, I was like, my brain was like fluctuating over here. I also want to add, really empowering our communities to be able to do for themselves and be self-sufficient. I think that's a huge thing as well. We don't want to keep relying on these systems to support us and to rectify everything that's happened within our history. We really want to get to a space where we can take care of ourselves, and that be something that's continued over generation and generation, because that's real generational wealth, when you don't need to rely on a system or a government to help take care of you.
Candace, thank you.
And I think,
Yeah, Candace, thank you. Some of you might have seen the icon. It was called A Decade for People of African Descent, and the advertisement, and that is connected to 2015 to 2024 Decade for People of African Descent that has 3 principles. One is recognition, right? We got to recognize things for what they are and recognize the people. The second principle is justice, and of course that's reparations. And the third level is development. So if we take those 3 principles and we work them, we'll be able to get to the solution that we need to. But it's important, and I really want to thank the organization for allowing that icon to be placed in the promotional flyer, because people don't even know that slavery was declared a crime against humanity in 2001. I was a delegate at the United Nations World Conference Against Racism, which was actually the 3rd conference. And now, just this past December, there was in Geneva, Switzerland, there was something called the Permanent Forum for People of African Descent. Right, so things are happening, on local level, on state level, on national level, on international level, and we have to really be educated and connected to all those things, because when people work together, we know that we can change everything.
Yeah, that's great. And there is a question actually, Dr. O, I'm happy to have other people chime in, but maybe it would be best because you mentioned reparations. And I do think I have a fear these days because that word is now being kind of thrown around, I think, a little bit loosely. And so I would love for you maybe to put some more definition behind, like when you say reparations, you know, talking about national reparations versus kind of more local. I mean, I'm sorry, I'm sharing my opinion before, but yeah, would love for you to talk about kind of what you think about when you think about reparations, and if you have kind of resources or a vision for moving that forward. Yeah.
The first thing I would say is Callie House. Callie House was an African woman of African descent who said, since you didn't pay us for our labor, then you need to give us a pension. And they threw her in jail. She organized something like 250,000 people around. It's like, this is like 1895, something like that, right? To, I think, like 1920. The woman was phenomenal. So we have to look at the work of Callie House. And of course, we have to look at Queen Mother Moore, who also revitalized the reparations movement. And then we have to look at NCOBRA, the National Coalition of Blacks for Reparations, that has brought that movement forward yet again. And we have to look at the different activities that are taking place around the country. Asheville, North Carolina. We can look at the state of California. Right, we're talking about reparations, and Nkechi Tiafo, her book is called The Fire of Reparations, right? That just came out like last week. So there are resources there where we can finally talk about it. And then Boven says reparations is compensation, restitution, and rehabilitation, right? And that's the work that I work in. I work in the area of rehabilitation, because if you don't decolonize the mind, not just a question of getting the check, it's much more than that. How do you restore, how do you make a people whole again, right? So it's not so much like a definition that exists. People who've been wrong, they have the right to say what they want to be compensated. Yet we don't want to create a situation where a certain kind of reparations is paid, and then the very next day, everybody has Cadillacs, and no. It has to. One scholar said that it's taken all these years to get to this point. How many years do we need to not study the problem, but study the solution, where people can start to really be educated and intelligent about how we're going to make this work? Because I'm not interested in having, for lack of a better word, let's say $1 trillion, and of course that's very exaggerated. And then the very next day, all the money goes back to the bank or to the car places or houses just for the very next day. So it's a very complicated subject that we have to talk about it on a regular basis.
Yeah, Tiffany or Candace, do you want to add anything to that, or?
Yeah, I'll add my idea of what reparations would look like. This is more personal, but I'm sure that my fellow panelists would agree with a lot of these. Education, for one, adequate education that is inclusive of other cultures and history. That would be the number one thing for me, so that we're not continuing to perpetuate these ideas. As well as free mental health services for those who suffer from the legacies of slavery and the stealing of land for natives. I would also include tax exemptions. I don't know what that would look like, but I know taxes take out a lot of my paycheck, and it would be really nice not to have that money taken out and being able to save it for other things like buying a home or starting a business. And then lastly, I would state the investment and equity programs that will help rectify some of the side effects of what has happened in our country.
There's a book, I was looking it up, that my mother made me read, thank God, she used to make me read these things. And I picked it up again during George Floyd. It was by Martin Luther King, Why We Can't Wait. Because I was just like, we need a plan. And she was like, the plan is written, right? But I say all of that all the time, right? Because obviously Martin is one of these like prominent figures, but I mean, Huey wrote some, like folks were, Assad was writing them, folks were like, we've already given you a plan. like we're saying what they said. Harriet asked for some, right? Frederick. So when I think about it, I think when we always get confused as a society about this, I'm like, I don't think we're confused. I think we're, to Dr. O's point, unwilling to give up. Like when you ask people what they want, you have to be willing to like You can't determine what's fair if you benefit from the actual system and society. It's never going to be fair to you. I've had to have this conversation. I'm like, when I know I'm on the right track, when a lot of my white colleagues are not feeling like it's fair, I'm like, yeah, it should not feel, it's not fair to me how I'm living either. And so the work, to Candace's point, is like, what is fairness? And who needs to determine that? And how do we let Black youth lead the movements and let them lead with the, listen, children will tell you, white children will tell you, this is messed up. How do we start in our organizations? How do we start to think about it when it comes to paid leave? I'm like, did y'all ask Black women how much paid leave we need? We need unlimited. Like, when we start to think about this can happen on every level. It can happen in your institution. Sit and just ask. What does a fair pay leave policy look like in our organization? So we can repair, like, simple. And then be willing to say, okay, if they say we want to work from home indefinitely, and not be like, oh, you see how this goes?
Plantation.
It's right. It's like, right? Like, it's release. Reparations is about releasing.
Yeah. I'd like to invite people to stop saying white privilege. I really would like you to stop saying that. And I would prefer that you say unjust enrichment. When someone steals something from someone else, that's unjust enrichment. It's not just a privilege where, oh, you have this privilege and I don't. No, we're talking about a criminal act. We're talking about a criminal act, and we're talking about a criminal possession, right? This wealth is really stolen wealth. So we're talking about unjust enrichment. And when we get more sophisticated in our language, we'll be able to see what this thing is really in front of us and then be able to deconstruct it. So no more white privilege, it's unjust enrichment.
Thank you for that, Dr. O. And I realize we have about I'm sorry, I didn't manage time well for this last question, but and I realize I don't even like this question because I'm playing into white supremacy here about this either or thinking when I wrote this question. But one of my last reflections here, which Dr. O kind of just answered, but we covered a lot. This was, a fabulous discussion. The chat is lighting up. People are really, a lot is really resonating with folks. But if there is kind of one thing, Tiffany brought up gender, unpacking gender. I think Dr. E brought up power. You just talked about unjust enrichment versus white privilege. But if there's kind of one concept, one piece of history, one policy, is there something that you would definitely just want to underline or just add right before we wrap up here today that you really would urge folks to look at more deeply after this webinar is over? Candace, do you have something on your mind for that?
Yeah, I kind of already stated it, looking into the elements of white supremacy culture. It plays into every aspect of our lives. And if you're not able to identify it, there's no way that you're going to be able to deconstruct it and unlearn it.
Thank you. And Tiffany?
Was it a policy only you asked?
Yeah, so just kind of one concept, policy, piece of history that hasn't been mentioned or that you would just want to underline as being really important that people understand.
How it's all made up, the race, the gender. If you really step back and say, this is made up, and explore that, make up our own stuff. We could make up some liberatory stuff. If it is all made up, then what?
Yeah. It's so funny. I have a post-it above my computer that says it's all made up. I look at it every day.
It's so relaxing.
And Dr. O.
But with real material manifestations. I don't want to, right?
Yeah.
But those are just a manifestation of something that's all made up. You get that?
Yeah. Thank you, Tiffany. And Dr. O, any last word here?
Yeah, I agree with Tiffany. Race was a social construction, was made up, and we can make up anything we want, but we have to have the courage to fight for it. I would say declare racism a public health crisis. That's like in the county or in the state, but where you work. How is racism being discussed? Where you work. It has to be localized. In that, I would and connected to that is take the Undoing Racism workshop out of the People's Institute for Survival and Beyond, because it's an organizing mechanism. It's not just a workshop like you get a certificate. No, it's an organizing mechanism. And of course, become a member of United for a fair economy, where they have all these workshops and all these different charts and things, which is phenomenal. So those that's Declare Racism,
Thank
you
you.
know, public health public health crises, and to be connected to those two organizations.
Thank you all so much for this. And Kelly, I apologize for only handing it back to you with a minute left, but I believe you're going to close us out today. But just huge gratitude to you all. Yeah.
Yes, yes. Oh, goodness. Diane, I think you're going to share slides. We've got the. That's okay. Well, while you're doing that, I mean, whoo, how lucky are we to have just to be able to be counted in the number with these folks. This was an amazing panel. So much knowledge and information dropped. And so we want to for sure thank all of our panelists, thank our moderator for your forthrightness and your engagement and your participation. This was a really dynamic way to start the year. I hope you all are feeling as energized and taking notes as I was on all the things that people mentioned, the concepts and books and themes and just things for us to dive into. And if you are like me and you're like, oh, I missed something, you should know that we will send out a resource list. The resource list will have things for you to read and listen to and dive into as you're learning more about all of this. And you're like, well, what did that person say? And what was that reference? Our panelists were really generous to share their recommendations for the resource list. And then we have some as well. So that will go out to everyone who was registered. We also want you to please take the survey so that we know what landed for you and what you're curious about and what you want to take a deeper dive on, so that the education series can continue to be a benefit to us all. And just a reminder that the series is ongoing, so we'll continue to explore closing the gender wealth gap, and the dates and topics are listed here. We also want to continue the conversation about white supremacy, engage more with you, our partners and community. So check out our social media and our website for announcements and follow us for more information and invitations to join us in this work. Thank you to our panelists. Thank you everyone for participating, and have a wonderful night.
Thank you. You're all awesome. Thank you.
Thank you
Good
so
night.
much.
Thank you so
Good
much.
night.